The dark chef. Thanksgiving was supposed to be normal that year. Just a quiet dinner with my parents and my little sister, Olivia. No drama. No unexpected guests. Just turkey, mashed potatoes, and maybe a little too much pumpkin pie. But that's not what happened. Instead, we met him, and by the end of the night, I wasn't sure if I was going to survive. My name is Aaron, and this is the story of the chef who turned Thanksgiving into a nightmare. It all started because Mom wanted something special. For years, she'd been talking about hiring a professional chef for Thanksgiving. Not that she wasn't a good cook. She was great, but I think she was tired of doing all the work. So, this year, Dad finally gave in. He found the ad online. No name, just private chef for special occasions and a phone number. It was cheap, too cheap, if you ask me, but Dad said it was a holiday deal. I didn't think much of it at the time. The chef showed up at noon, right on schedule. He was tall and thin, dressed in a crisp black suit with a white apron over it. His face was narrow, pale, and sharp, like it had been carved from marble. His eyes, though they were the worst, black as midnight, with no whites or pupils, just endless, empty voids. "Mr. and Mrs. Carter," he said, his voice smooth and soft, like silk gliding over glass. "It's a pleasure to serve your family." Mom looked a little uncomfortable, but Dad, ever the optimist, laughed it off. "Well, let's see what you can do." The chef took over the kitchen immediately, moving with precision and speed. The way he worked was mesmerizing. His hands moved so fast they were a blur, chopping vegetables and seasoning meat with almost inhuman efficiency. The smells that filled the house were incredible, rich, savory, and sweet all at once, like the best meal you'd ever imagine. I tried to talk to him once, asking what he was making. He didn't look up, didn't even acknowledge me, just kept chopping and stirring. His movements mechanical and perfect. Mom brushed it off. "He's probably just focused," she said. "Let him work." But Olivia didn't like him. She was only 8, and kids can sense things that adults ignore. She stayed close to me, clutching my hand every time we passed the kitchen. Dinner was served at 6 p.m. sharp. The dining table was piled high with food: golden brown turkey, fluffy mashed potatoes, candied yams, green beans with slivered almonds, cranberry sauce that glistened like jewels. Everything looked perfect. The chef stood at the head of the table, his hands clasped in front of him. "Please," he said, his voice soft but commanding. "Enjoy." We didn't need to be told twice. The first bite was like nothing I'd ever tasted before. Every flavor was amplified, richer and more intense than anything I'd ever experienced. The turkey melted in my mouth. The mashed potatoes were impossibly creamy, and the cranberry sauce had the perfect balance of tart and sweet. Even Olivia, who hated green beans, cleaned her plate. But then things got strange. Started with Dad. He was telling one of his usual corny jokes when he stopped mid-sentence, his fork hovering in the air, his eyes glazed over, and for a moment, he looked like he didn't recognize us. "Dad," I said, leaning forward. He blinked, then smiled. But it wasn't his usual smile. It was too wide, stretching across his face like a rubber band pulled too tight. His teeth seemed sharper, and his voice had a strange echo when he spoke. "I'm fine," he said. "Just fine." Next was Mom. She dropped her fork with a clatter, clutching her head like she had a migraine. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. "Hear what?" I asked, my chest tightening. "The singing," she said, her voice shaking. "It's beautiful." There was no singing, just the faint hum of the heater kicking on. But her face lit up with a terrifying, otherworldly joy. She started humming along, swaying in her seat like she was lost in a trance. Olivia started crying, tugging on my sleeve. "Aaron, I don't feel good," she whimpered. I didn't feel good either. My head was spinning, and the room seemed to tilt and shift, like the walls were breathing. The shadows in the corners grew darker, stretching and twisting into impossible shapes. That's when I noticed the chef. He was still standing at the head of the table, watching us with that unnerving, empty stare. He hadn't touched the food, hadn't moved a muscle, but his presence felt heavier, like he was taking up more space than before. "What's in the food?" I demanded, my voice shaking. He tilted his head, his lips curling into a faint smile. "Just what you asked for," he said. "A special meal." The room descended into chaos. Dad's laughter grew louder, more hysterical, as his teeth seemed to grow sharper, more animalistic. Mom was on her feet, spinning in circles, her hands clawing at the air as if she was trying to catch something invisible. Olivia clung to me, her small body trembling. Her eyes were wide, and when I looked closer, I saw that they weren't her eyes anymore. They were black, just like the chef's, endless voids that reflected nothing. "Help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I tried to stand, but my legs buckled. My own hands didn't feel like mine anymore. My skin rippled, shifting and stretching as if something underneath was trying to claw its way out. I don't know how I did it, but I managed to grab Olivia and drag her out of the dining room. The chef didn't try to stop us. He just watched, his smile growing wider as the room behind us filled with snarls and screams. We locked ourselves in my bedroom, barricading the door with a dresser. I held Olivia close, whispering that everything would be okay. Though I didn't believe it, the sounds from downstairs grew louder. Laughter, growls, the sound of furniture splintering, and then silence. When I finally worked up the courage to leave the room, the house was empty. The dining table was pristine, the plates clean, as if nothing had happened. Mom, Dad, and the chef were gone. Olivia and I were the only ones left. The police didn't believe me. They said my parents must have left, abandoning us, and that the chef was just a figment of my imagination. But I know what I saw. Olivia doesn't talk much anymore. She just stares at me with those black, empty eyes, her small hands trembling. I don't know how long she'll stay like this or how long I will, but every Thanksgiving, I hear the chef's voice in my dreams, soft and cold as winter wind. Enjoy! Story number 2. The Thanksgiving haunting. It was supposed to be a fresh start. That's what Mom kept saying when we moved into the old house on Ridgeway Road, just 2 weeks before Thanksgiving. She said it like it was a mantra, a shield against the fact that we were leaving everything familiar behind. Dad was trying to keep things light, cracking jokes about how we'd finally have enough space to stretch out. But even he couldn't hide the unease in his voice when we first pulled up to the house. The house was old, too old. It loomed at the end of a long gravel driveway, its paint peeling and windows dark like empty eyes. A sagging porch wrapped around the front, the kind you'd imagine creaking under the weight of ghosts. But it was cheap, and that's what mattered. Think of it as a blank slate, Mom said, her voice bright but strained. We'll make it a home. The first few days were uneventful. We spent most of our time unpacking, scrubbing decades of grime from the floors, and trying to figure out how to make the ancient plumbing work. The only strange thing was the attic. It had a heavy, padlocked door at the top of a narrow staircase, and no one seemed to have a key. It's probably just storage, Dad said when I asked about it. We'll deal with it later. But every night, I heard noises coming from up there, faint, uneven footsteps, like someone pacing back and forth. At first, I thought it was the house settling or maybe a raccoon, but the sound was too deliberate, too human. I didn't say anything. I didn't want to seem like the weird kid scared of the new house. Thanksgiving snuck up on us before we knew it. Mom was determined to make it special, to start some new family tradition in our forever home. She spent the whole day in the kitchen, filling the house with the smell of roasting turkey and fresh-baked pies. For a little while, felt normal, almost cozy. That night, as we were setting the table in the big, drafty dining room, the noises started again. But this time, they weren't coming from the attic. They were downstairs, in the dining room with us. It started with the chairs, I was arranging the silverware when one of the chairs slid out from the table on its own. It was slow, deliberate, the legs scraping against the floor with a grating sound that made my skin crawl. "Did you see that?" I whispered. Mom froze, the stack of plates trembling in her hands. "It's just uneven floors," she said, her voice too loud, too forced. "Old houses do that." But Dad was staring at the chair, his face pale. "That didn't look like uneven floors," he muttered. Before anyone could say anything else, there was a loud thump from above us. Then another. It sounded like something heavy had fallen, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, pacing back and forth. "Maybe it's the wind," Mom said, but she didn't sound convinced. We tried to ignore it, to act like everything was fine. We sat down to dinner, the table crowded with food, but no one really ate. The footsteps continued overhead, echoing through the house, a constant reminder that we weren't alone. Halfway through dinner, the lights flickered. The chandelier above the table swayed slightly, casting strange, shifting shadows across the room. I glanced at the chair that had moved earlier, half expecting it to start sliding again. Instead, I noticed something else. The air had grown colder, sharp and biting like a winter draft. And then I saw the figure. First, it was just a shadow near the doorway, faint and blurry, but as I stared, it grew more distinct, a tall, thin man in old-fashioned clothes, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes dark pits. He stood there, watching us, his expression unreadable. "Dad," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Do you see him?" "See what?" Dad said, but when he turned toward the doorway, his fork clattered to his plate. The man was gone. That night, none of us could sleep. Mom and Dad locked the bedroom doors, and I stayed in my room with my little sister, Emma, who was too young to understand what was happening but scared enough to cling to me like a lifeline. The footsteps continued, louder now, joined by whispers we couldn't quite make out. Sometimes, there were knocks on the walls, soft at first but growing more insistent. Around midnight, the whispers grew louder. I strained to hear them, pressing my ear against the wall. At first, it sounded like gibberish, but then I caught a few words. "Help us? Why did you let this happen?" I pulled away, my heart pounding. The voices weren't just random, they were pleading. The next day, I did some digging. I went to the library in town, asking about the house. The librarian gave me a strange look but handed me an old newspaper article. The headline read, "Thanksgiving Massacre at Ridgway House. Family of 6 found dead." My hands shook as I read the story. The house had belonged to a family named the Thompsons in the 1920s. On Thanksgiving night, the father, Samuel Thompson, had gone mad, attacking his wife and children with a carving knife before hanging himself in the attic. The police never figured out why he did it. Neighbors claimed he'd been acting strange in the weeks leading up to the murders, talking about seeing ghosts and hearing voices in the house. I felt sick. The attic, the footsteps, the whispers. It all made sense now. When I got home, I told my parents everything. Dad wanted to leave immediately, but Mom insisted we couldn't abandon the house. "We just need to cleanse it," she said, grabbing a handful of sage from the kitchen drawer like it was some kind of magic wand. That night, we tried the ritual. Mom walked through the house, burning sage and muttering prayers, while Dad sprinkled salt along the windowsills. For a while, it seemed to work. The air felt lighter, the house quieter. But then the attic door unlocked itself. We heard the padlock hit the floor with a heavy clang. The door creaked open slowly, revealing the dark staircase beyond. A cold wind blew down from the attic, carrying with it the smell of decay. Dad grabbed a flashlight, his face grim. "Stay here," he said. "Don't go up there," Mom begged, but he didn't listen. He climbed the stairs, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. I stayed at the bottom, holding Emma's hand, listening to his footsteps. Then the screaming started. I don't remember much after that, just flashes, Dad stumbling down the stairs, blood dripping from his arm, the shadowy figures pouring out of the attic, their faces twisted with rage and sorrow. Emma screaming as the dining room chairs flew across the room like they'd been thrown by invisible hands. We ran, left everything behind and never looked back. The house still stands, empty and rotting, its windows staring out like empty eyes. Sometimes I dream about it, about the whispers and the footsteps and the figure in the doorway. And every Thanksgiving, I hear the voices again, faint and pleading, "Help us? Why did you let this happen?" Story number 3. The turkey that wouldn't die. Thanksgiving has always been a big deal in my family. My mom called it the one day a year we all pretend to like each other. Dad would roast a turkey big enough to feed an army, and we'd gather in the dining room of our old farmhouse, surrounded by creaking floorboards and the faint smell of wood smoke. It was tradition. But Thanksgiving 2012 wasn't like the others. That was the year the turkey came back. I know how that sounds. You're probably laughing already, thinking this is some kind of joke. I wish it was. I wish I could forget the smell of burning feathers and the sound of that thing's claws tearing through the hardwood floor. But I can't. So I'm telling you now. As a warning, be careful what you put on your table. It started like any other Thanksgiving. I was 16, stuck at home in the middle of nowhere with my younger brother, Mikey, and my parents. We lived on a small farm in western Pennsylvania, miles from the nearest neighbor, the kind of place where the wind howling through the trees at night sounded like voices. That year, Dad went all out. He bought the biggest turkey I'd ever seen from a local farmer named Old Man Crenshaw. Crenshaw was a weird guy, always muttering about curses and respecting the natural order. But he had the best poultry in the county, and Dad couldn't resist a good deal. The turkey was massive, 28 pounds, with a wingspan that could have knocked over a toddler. Mom spent hours prepping it, stuffing it with her special sage dressing and rubbing it down with butter. By the time it went into the oven, the whole house smelled like a Norman Rockwell painting. Dinner started off fine. Mikey and I argued over who got the first slice of pie. Dad told his usual bad jokes, and Mom tried to keep the peace. The turkey was the centerpiece, golden brown and glistening under the dim light of the chandelier. It looked perfect, like something out of a magazine. Dad carved it with his electric knife, the buzzing sound cutting through the chatter at the table. "Dig in," he said, piling slices of meat onto our plates. I don't know if it was the taste or the texture, but something about the turkey felt wrong. The meat was tougher than usual, with a faint metallic tang that made my stomach churn. Mikey made a face after his first bite. "This tastes weird," he said, poking at his plate with his fork. "Don't be ridiculous," Mom snapped. "It's just turkey." Dad laughed and took another bite. "Tastes fine to me. Maybe you've just got city boy taste buds, Mikey." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. We were halfway through dinner when it happened. Mikey was reaching for the mashed potatoes when the chandelier flickered. The lights dimmed, plunging the room into an eerie half-darkness. "Power's probably out," Dad said, standing up. "I'll check the fuse box." But before he could move, the turkey, the perfectly roasted, carved turkey, twitched. I froze, my fork halfway to my mouth. At first, I thought I'd imagined it, but then it twitched again, a violent shudder that sent greasy juices splattering across the table. "What the hell?" Dad muttered, leaning closer. The turkey moved. Its wings, which had been neatly tucked against its body, snapped outward with a sickening crack. Its headless neck, a charred, gaping stump, jerked upright, as if sniffing the air. The drumsticks twitched, then slammed against the platter with enough force to rattle the silverware. "What's happening?" Mom shrieked, backing away from the table. The turkey let out a low, guttural sound, somewhere between a growl and a gurgle. Then it jumped. The platter shattered as the turkey launched itself off the table, landing on the floor with a wet thud. For a moment, we all just stared, too stunned to move. Then it turned toward us, his headless neck twisted unnaturally, pointing straight at Dad. The meat on its body began to shift, pulling apart and reforming in grotesque, unnatural ways. Wings that shouldn't have been there sprouted from its sides, jagged and bony, with feathers that were charred black at the edges. Its legs grew longer, ending in claws that scratched deep grooves into the wood. "Oh my God," Mom whispered, clutching Mikey. The turkey lunged at Dad. It happened so fast. One moment, Dad was standing there, staring in disbelief. The next, the turkey was on him, his claws tearing into his chest. He screamed, trying to fight it off, but the thing was too strong. Blood sprayed across the dining room as it ripped into him, its gurgling growl echoing through the house. "Run!" Mom screamed, shoving Mikey and me toward the kitchen. We bolted, the sound of Dad's screams following us down the hallway. Mom grabbed a butcher knife from the counter, her hands shaking. "What is that thing?" Mikey cried, tears streaming down his face. "I don't know," Mom said, her voice trembling. "But we need to get out of here." We didn't make it far. The turkey smashed through the dining room door, his body even more grotesque now. The skin had split open, revealing muscles and sinew that pulsed with unnatural energy. Its wings beat the air, sending splinters flying as it tore through the doorway. Mom swung the knife, but the turkey was too fast. It knocked her to the ground, claws raking across her arm. She screamed, kicking at it as it loomed over her. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a cast iron skillet, and swung it with all my strength. The skillet connected with a sickening crunch, and the turkey staggered back. It let out a furious screech, his headless neck whipping around like a snake. "Go!" Mom shouted, clutching her bleeding arm. "Get Mikey out of here!" We ran upstairs, barricading ourselves in my bedroom. Mikey was sobbing, his face buried in his hands. I tried to stay calm, but the sound of the turkey's claws scraping against the walls made my skin crawl. Then the scratching stopped. The silence was worse. It stretched on, heavy and oppressive, until I couldn't take it anymore. I pressed my ear to the door, straining to hear anything. That's when the door splintered. The turkey burst through, his claws slashing wildly. I grabbed Mikey and shoved him toward the window. "Go! Climb down the trellis." "What about you?" he cried. "Just go." I don't remember much after that. There was a lot of screaming, a lot of blood. When I woke up, the house was in ruins. The walls were scorched black, the furniture reduced to ash. There was no sign of the turkey or my family. I tried to tell the police what happened, but they didn't believe me. Who would? They said the fire was caused by a faulty fuse box, that my family had been trapped inside. But I know the truth. Every Thanksgiving, I hear it, the sound of claws on wood, the faint smell of burning feathers, is still out there, waiting, and one day, it'll come back for me.